This is merely just a practice to get used to using the direct selection arrow and shapes tools. I've started a new document in Adobe Illustrator. It's blank, it's letter size, and if you notice again in my layers panel, I'm on layer number 1. I'm not creating any sort of template, I'm just merely going to be playing with shapes, so I'm not making any sort of template layer. So let's get started. I'm going to go down to my fill and stroke squares, and I'm going to change my fill from white to a much brighter color. I'll choose red and press OK. I don't want a stroke, so I'm going to click once on the stroke square. Make sure that you click on the none for stroke. Remember, it's that white square with the red diagonal line through it. I now have no stroke but a red fill. We're going to venture out into our shapes tool on the toolbar. It might say rectangle tool, it might say ellipse or different type of polygon. Mine happens to say rectangle. If you like keyboard shortcuts, you can simply press the letter M. I press the letter M. You should get what appears to be like a cross. So let's make a tear off menu really similar to our pen tool tear off. To do a tear off menu, I'm going to click and hold down on my rectangle, my shapes tool. We can see all the different options that we have here. We have rectangle, rounded rectangle, ellipse, polygon, star, and flare. There may be more or less depending on the version of Illustrator that you're using. I'm going to make a tear off little menu, so remember to make a tear off you go all the way over to the right, and I'm going to release. Now I have all my shapes in a neat compact little menu. We're going to start off with the rectangle, so I'm going to click and drag out the blue rectangle, release, there it is. But now here comes the fun part. You can modify your shapes using the white arrow, which happens to be on the toolbar, my direct selection tool, or the letter A if you'd like to use keyboard shortcuts. I can click on an anchor point. So let's zoom in a little bit so you can see this a little bit better. Let's go back by pressing A to my direct selection tool. I can now click on an anchor point and drag it and move across the artboard here. I want you to practice this at home or in the Mac Lab at the historic Beefer campus or the Mac Lab at the St. Helena Branch Library. This is really a lot of fun. I want you all to get comfortable clicking on these anchor points and creating brand new shapes. It's a little known secret in using Adobe Illustrator that you can truly do this. Let's take a look. Okay, so we see now that my shape looks very much, it looks very different than the original rectangle I started out with. Remember that with your shapes you can also delete and add anchor points. So I kept up my pen tool tear off menu for that reason. I'm going to actually go up here to my delete anchor point tool. I'm going to get rid of this anchor point down here by simply clicking on it. I now have a triangle. I can go back to my direct selection tool, just click and drag on those anchor points. So now I have a triangle and I can modify this shape. We're going to deselect this shape, so I'm actually going to click on my selection tool with the black arrow. We know that it's activated because there's a rectangle of blue around it. We need to deactivate it first so we can create a new shape. So I'm going to click off of that shape. I'm now going to go back to my toolbar for my shapes tools. Let's talk about some of the other ones here. We have what's called a rounded rectangle. I clicked on that one. I'm going to click and drag out a rounded rectangle. These are really popular if you think of stickers, labels, sometimes word balloons for comic books. This is very nice to have the shape available. But you might notice that there are more anchor points on the corners of this shape versus the regular rectangle. Let's talk about how you can modify what the difference is between rounded edges and sharp pointed edges, geometric edges. I'm actually going to go back to my direct selection tool and I'm going to click on this anchor point. You might notice that we get some handlebars here. Let me zoom in on that. We get some handlebars because it's a curve. If you remember using your pen tool from your previous exercises, whenever you create a curved path, you will get these really long handlebars. So I'm actually going to go back to my direct selection tool, the white arrow. I can click on the handlebar, click and drag out, and I can modify the curve for this shape. It only affects the curve, and as you can see, very different than what we had started out with. I'm actually going to make my handlebar a little bit shorter. Got a nice curve going on there. The anchor point that is right here, if I happen to click and drag, it's at a pointed edge because that's just the shape of this form of the rounded rectangle. Again, as a reminder, if you want to ever delete or add anchor points, you can always go up to your pen tool menu. I have my little tear off still up. I'm going to delete this anchor point because it's getting in the way. And as a result, I have a very large curve, very large mass. So I'm going to go back to my white arrow, my direct selection tool, and now I can create a very wide curve cutting into this shape. Let's zoom out to see what this looks like. Remember to zoom out. You can always press the Alt or Option key while having the magnifying glass selected. So I'm well on my way. I'm actually going to delete this anchor point right here, and now I can go back to my direct selection arrow. I'm going to create a curve going way out. I want to delete this anchor point down here. It looks a little awkward. Now I have a really nice smooth curve. If you ever need to add anchor points, so for example, if I accidentally get rid of that one anchor point down there, I really want it back, you can always go to your pen tool, tear off menu, select the add anchor point tool. As long as you are on the path, and you know that because of the green word, your smart guide that says path, you can add an anchor point. This one happened to add handlebars right off the bat. So I'm going to go back to my direct selection, and I now have handlebars that I can click and drag using my white arrow tool. I'm going to go upward. Let's zoom out and see what we've got here. So a very modified shape. You would have never known that started out as a rounded rectangle. Let's go through briefly some of the other shapes. I'm going to click on my selection tool. It's bounded in a box. I want to deselect it, so I'm going to click outside the box on the outboard, on the artboard. We have our ellipse. Here's the thing with ellipses. You can click and drag to create an oval. That looks nice. I'm actually going to delete that for a second. So I'm going to press Command Z. On Windows, you would press Control Z. If you hold down the Shift key and have the ellipse tool selected, you will have a perfect circle, which is nice. So again, Shift key, hold down the Shift key, click and drag it out, you will have a perfect circle. I'm going to zoom in. Anytime there's a curved path, I'm going to take my white arrow direct selection tool, click on this anchor point, get those handlebars. I can now modify the different curves on this shape. I can bring them in if I want to. Let me take this one, modify the handlebars. Let's make it kind of skinny looking. Okay, I'm going to zoom back out to see what we've got. As you can see, very modified shape. What are some other ones on here? Well, first we need to deselect, so clicking on selection tool, have our bounding box. I'm going to click outside of the box. It is now deselected. Let's get to a clear space on our artboard. The next shape is the polygon tool. I'm going to click on it. It looks like it appears to be a hexagon or something similar. You can click once on your artboard and you have an option here. You can choose how big you want your radius to be and how many sides you want your polygon to be. So right now mine is selected to be a hexagon because it has 6 sides. You can go as far down as 3. You can go up to as many as infinity, but keep in mind, if I happen to have a more traditional polygon, so 8 sides, an octagon, you press OK, it gives you a generated pretty perfect shape. But you can always modify those anchor points by going up to the direct selection arrow. Let's go inward. Let's go inward. Okay. So that is now our modified octagon, but let's take a look at and see what happens whenever you have a polygon tool that has a lot of sides. So I'm going to deselect this, need to click on my selection tool, get my bounding box. Now I'm going to deselect by clicking on the artboard. Let's click on our polygon tool again. I'm going to only click once, and I'm going to pick some crazy number. I'm going to pick 500. Press OK. It looks very much like a circle, doesn't it? So the more points you have, the more like a circle it's going to look. So even if I were to zoom in on all of these hundreds of crazy points, as you can see as I get closer and closer, there's a lot of anchor points that I can play around with and modify the shapes here. So I'm going to use my white arrow, and I'm going to click on the anchor point. Okay, because it's so close together, it only makes a tiny impact on the shape. But then again, I made such a really crazy shape by having 500 anchor points, but as you can see, it's very much like a circle. But same idea, you can just take your anchor points and modify the shape. I'm going to deselect this, so I'm going to click on my black arrow, click off. We also have a star tool, so if I click on the star tool, click once, really similar to your polygon tool, I'm going to choose how many points I have. So if you want a more traditional star, you might want 5, you can go all the way down to 3. So I'm going to keep mine as 5 to make it more traditional, press OK. I get a little upside down star, but don't worry, you can always click on your selection tool, your black arrow, you get that bounding box. You can always turn the orientation of your shape. So once you get your bounding box, you can go up to the corner. I chose the upper right hand corner, and I get sort of a curved double-headed arrow. I can click and drag it to where I want it. This is a more traditional star that we see all the time. Okay, so I'm going to click outside of the bounding box. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and start playing around modifying the shape. So I'm going to take my white arrow, activate my shape, I'm going to click on the top anchor point, and now I can make this a non-star. I just clip all these pieces together. That looks like a very funky, very different star. So there we go. I wouldn't be really concerned about the flare tool. That's not something that we're going to be using for Project 1, your celebrity shapes portrait. So I wouldn't, you can certainly play around with it, but it's something that I will not require for you to have within that assignment. But I highly recommend that you do take the time to play around with these shapes. Get comfortable using the direct selection tool, because as you're going to see in the next video tutorial, your portrait, it is supposed to look very stylized, and I have those examples up on Blackboard. But it's supposed to look very stylized, and it's going to be reliant upon you to layer upon layer different modified shapes to match your template image. So I would definitely recommend you playing with shapes for a little bit and getting really comfortable.